Welcome to Behind the Bar on June 30th, 2025. That will forever be known, Derek, as the first day of jury deliberations in the People versus Sean Diddy Combs.
It's D-Day, Deliberation Day, Jason.
D-Day, exciting stuff. So stealing the show for the day, the fact that the jury has sent two different questions for the judge, not uncommon, but commentators and lawyers try to divine, read tea leaves, figure out what it is the jury meant by this and which way does it tend to lean. So talk about the first question they sent. It was only after about an hour of deliberations this morning, which is very quick, and the nature of the question was sort of left us all puzzled.
Yes, this was strange. I expected them to go into deliberations and not be heard of for a period of time. This is a very complicated case. There's volumes of evidence. They've got a packet of materials. They got a 61-page document of instructions from the judge. They've got a verdict sheet. I thought they were going to be swimming in it, maybe take some straw polls.
Well, typically, so the jury will have a giant whiteboard there, right? And there's a four-person. They elected the four-person early. They announced what number the four-person was. And typically the four-person will stand up at the whiteboard and start writing down the charges, the elements for each charge, and then they will start to parse through the evidence. And to your point, that can take quite a long time. But here, an hour in, apparently they had a snag.
Yeah, fewer than 2 hours away when they started these deliberations, a note was sent. And what happens is they go into this black box, but they can send out missives to the judge saying, we don't understand something. Could you help us? Your instructions are unclear in one way or another, or we're having some interpersonal dynamics that we need someone to intervene because we're not able to solve a problem. The first note was kind of in the latter category because they didn't say we're confused about an instruction. What they said was there's a juror in our room, juror number 25, who, quote, cannot follow your honor's instructions. And that was the way the note was phrased. Cannot follow your honor's instructions. That sounds like the person was unable to follow the instructions. That might be a question of intellect. That might be a question of focus and concentration, but the
mental acuity,
maybe just
suffer from a condition. It could be a lot of different things.
It didn't sound like defiance.
They didn't say that this juror, I don't know, he or she will not, refuses to.
Those are words of defiance,
right?
That someone just folded their arms and said, I don't care what the judge says, and I don't care what those instructions say. This is how I feel. That's not the way it was phrased.
Now, interestingly, we actually do know the person was a man, and it's a 51-year-old professor.
Yes.
And so the idea at the end, we don't know anything, but the idea that they didn't have the intellect to follow
seems unlikely.
Unlikely, right?
And they've been through the ringer of the jury selection process,
yes,
which was arduous in this
yes.
case. There was a big questionnaire. They had to answer questions during voir dire. Presumably, if they had a real sort of cognitive impairment that presented itself at the beginning of trial, they would have been weeded out.
Now, 2 months has gone by, so we don't know. It's possible things would happen. But where people have gone with this, commentators have gone with this, is maybe this juror was refusing to participate in the deliberative process.
Yes.
Was either in some way announced early on, this is my feeling on this case, and I'm not going to be dissuaded, and I'm not going to engage in the deliberative process with you. Or maybe was just sitting off to the side and simply wouldn't communicate in any way.
It's truly ambiguous, right? The statement says what it says. It says, cannot follow your honor's instructions. Again, this was a 61-page packet of instructions, some of which are very basic instructions like you guys are to go back there
yes.
and you are to deliberate. If it's that instruction, you're right. This sounds like someone who said, I'm not hip to it. I got my mind made up, and I'm not going to engage in you trying to convince me or me trying to convince you. I'm voting the way I'm voting. And if the foreperson says, well, that's not constructive, that's not good faith deliberations, I've got to tell the judge that you're not participating.
Right.
Maybe dangled that threat. Maybe the guy folded his arms and said, do what you got to do. And the letter was sent out to the judge.
And so the judge responds with, it's way too early for me to
get back in there.
Get back in there. I'm not even going to entertain your problems. I'm going to send it back in there.
He also told them, and I think this is interesting and instructive, he said, I wanted to remind every juror of their duty to deliberate. So he indicated that he thought this question was about not deliberating in good faith. And he said, it's your obligation to follow my instructions on the law and please continue deliberating. He also said, don't reveal any specifics about the nature of your conversations in the jury room. He's telling them it's okay to come out with a question and say this guy isn't participating, but don't tell me the nature of your dispute because I don't want to disrupt and have a mistrial by you sort of telling me what you're conflicted about. Then I give you an instruction. It looks like I'm putting a thumb on the scale in one way or the other.
And just so we're clear, there's nothing that's happening between the judge and the jurors that we're not fully privy to. All of this happens in open court. When the bailiff tells the judge that the jury has a note, he calls all the counsel back into the room. He calls all the assembled media back into the room. He brings the jury out. They sit back in the box. They hand the note to the judge. The judge reads the note in open court. And so everybody's privy. It's not like there's any side conversations where the judge is trying to resolve this in any way. Everything that has happened, we are fully privy to. And so all we have is that the judge the jury presented this note. The judge answered it in the way that Derek just described, and then they're back in deliberating. They ended up deliberating for 5 total hours today. And right at the end of the day, they sent the judge note number 2. And I think there's a lot here and stuff we can tease out of this one.
Yeah, they had another question. Do you have the specific quote I know the nature of the comment. The comment was...
Yeah, I'll read it. In the note to the judge, the second note, the jurors asked, if a person asks for controlled substances and another person gives it to the requester, is the person who hands over the controlled substances considered to be distributing them, a distributor of those drugs?
Now, this question is very clear what they're getting at, because the only place in their verdict form where drug distribution comes up is on the racketeering conspiracy, the RICO conspiracy count.
Predicate act.
It's
right?
one of the predicate acts. There are 8 predicate acts. We've heard a lot about kidnapping, arson, bribery, witness tampering, forced labor, sex trafficking, transportation for purposes of prostitution, and drug distribution. It is one of the 8 predicate acts. What this question tells me is there are feelings in the jury room about what they think Diddy did, what has been proven by the prosecution, and they think it involves asking for drugs and handing drugs over. Maybe not necessarily buying drugs. And so they're asking this question, if this is what we have, is it distribution?
So right. So they're going through the predicate acts, and the jury is now confronted with this idea that Diddy seems to have provided drugs, or through third parties, provided drugs to Cassie and to the escorts, to the prostitutes, right? And so the jury's simply saying, we've heard testimony about that. Is that enough to satisfy the predicate act requirement for RICO? Remember, the prosecution has to prove two of them. 2 predicate acts. Is that enough for them to be? Is this enough for them to be one of the predicate acts? The answer to the question is yes.
The answer to the question is yes, and the prosecutors.
Now, the judge hasn't answered it yet. By the way, the judge said that they did this at the very end of court. So the judge sent them home for the day, bringing them back. But we know that the answer to that question from a legal point of view is yes.
And
that is sufficient.
Have said as much. They say you should answer this, Honor, and just say simply yes. That's enough. Diddy's team says, well, we want to weigh in. I want to confer with my legal team whether there's a nuance here. I think this has a black and white answer. The answer is yes. They may want to add some qualifying language to sort of not mislead the jury in some way. And the judge is going to be open to hearing their input. But ultimately, the answer is going to be some flavor of yes.
So given that the jurors asked this question, whether or not distribution from one person to another is a predicate act for RICO, and given that the answer to that question is yes, that's a very bad fact for Diddy.
It's horrendous for Diddy. And I'll tell you why. The 8 predicate acts, there's been so much hay made over kidnapping and arson, because obviously with arson, we had Kid Cudi. With kidnapping, there was testimony of Capricorn Clark being taken to a room and given a lie detector test. Those are the ones that sound like serious criminal acts. And so we thought a lot of the activity would be around, did they prove those? They don't need them. And I want to emphasize that actually this question shows me that maybe the jury wants to avoid needing to find that he's a kidnapper or an arsonist. They don't need it. That is 2 out of 8. The last 2 predicate acts in the jury verdict sheet are drug distribution, which is the nature of this question, and transportation for purposes of prostitution. The Mann Act is an underlying predicate act.
We know that one's a slam dunk.
Got it. So they have their 2.
And if they're asking this question about drug distribution, and the judge comes back and says yes, that is a predicate act, they have their 2. Not to mention they have others. Now, what's interesting, another way to look at it that might not be as favorable for the prosecution, more favorable for Diddy, is that there are jurors in that room who are like, we're looking for reasons why we don't want to prosecute. And we don't think this constitutes. We don't want to convict. And we're going to ask the judge, because we didn't even think this rises to the level. We're all the way down at drug distribution. These recalcitrant jurors, these jurors who don't want to convict, are saying he doesn't even have drug distribution. Those jurors on the other side are trying to sort of make their point through help with help from the judge. So maybe you have jurors who are like reluctant and they're not going to convict no matter what. I mean, there is that possibility.
I think that's right. And look, there's some skepticism in the question because the nature of the testimony was often, Cassie would say, I want some ketamine to go through this or something. And Diddy would furnish it, or a prostitute would say, I need some I want some drugs to have fun. And he would just give it. To many people, that's going to seem like a fairly innocuous act, not a criminal act. It's going to seem like someone who wanted
clearly
to party.
all consenting parties. It wasn't like anybody's being forced to take drugs.
He's not a dealer.
It wasn't like they were bringing him in and Cassie's like, I don't want to do drugs today, and he was forcing them out. No, everybody at these parties was doing drugs, and he was just bringing them in to satisfy
So
that.
you're right. Some people, the question kind of indicates that there may be skepticism. Is this really a crime? I've been at places where someone said they've got drugs, and I said, hey, can I have one? So I agree with you that the question bakes in some skepticism about whether something as innocuous sounding as that could be a crime. But once the judge says, yes, that is enough, they kind of will either nullify his instruction or act.
The more we're talking, though, the more that I'm sort of going back to this, maybe it's actually good for Diddy, because if there was unanimity that Diddy is a really, really bad actor and we need to throw the book at him, they wouldn't even need to ask this question. They're asking this question because there is some
about
skepticism about just the general, these prerequisites to RICO as it is. There's some skepticism, and they're trying to parse their way through the skepticism.
I tend to agree with you. I think there's some underlying skepticism about many of these predicate acts. Did he really firebomb the car? Did he really kidnap someone who was able to go home at night? The defense made a lot of hay over this, and I do think there's difficulty in getting there on some of those issues. But I think there's 8 options, and maybe they marched through them and said, well, they haven't proved these first 6. We're on the last 2, and we need to see if we can get them on that 8th one, drug distribution. That's possible.
Or it could be that, or it could be they're like, we don't even know, to your original point, we don't even need to go to these 6 harder ones. We got 2 easy ones right at the bat.
Yes.
Drugs count, right? That distribution, they're all like, I think so, not sure. Should we ask the judge if that one even counts? Yes, it counts. Okay, so we've got our 2 predicate acts. We're good on RICO.
Let's move on to sex trafficking. I kind of feel like at the end of the day, that's on balance what I believe. This is an easier path for them to convict on RICO than really wrestling with people over arson and kidnapping.
Yeah. All right, so let's turn to some questions and comments. Nancy Nicole says, what issues do you gentlemen see coming up on appeal? Should he need to appeal? Thank you, Jason and Derek. Awesome show. Well, thank you for the 5 stars in your comment. Love it. Appeal. Look, they've raised a ton of thorny legal issues. I think really it starts a lot with what evidence was initially allowed to be introduced by the judge, right? That we have the Cassie video. There was some argument that that's irrelevant to this case. So there's evidentiary issues.
There's some there's the things that they've asked for mistrials over, I think of as you should consider those possible grounds for appeal because they thought it was big enough and they made a lot of hay and brought mistrial motions. Judge Sobermanian, I think, ruled correctly and kept the trial moving along. But I look at all of those as the appellate lawyers preparing their appellate brief.
Mostly that revolved around the dismissal of the one juror and what was that juror up to. And But
was that a pretextual dismissal? Trying
because it was an African American person that they removed from the jury box. The one thing we need to keep in mind, Nancy, is it is exceedingly unlikely. It's very hard to get things overturned on appeal. We see it in movies and television shows. It seems rather easy, and it happens. But it can be very, very difficult to get things overturned.
I want to emphasize that just because errors were made in a trial doesn't mean that those errors are grounds for reversal.
It's got to be reversible error.
It's got to be reversible error. That's a big category because it's a big caveat because there's a lot of harmless errors. Hearsay objections that get overruled or sustained. That kind of stuff isn't going to turn a trial around unless you can say that particular objection that you ruled incorrectly on changed the whole outcome of the case. That's just hard to prove.
So it's been a minute, but I believe that the definition of reversible error is something along the lines of, but for that error, the trial likely would have come out differently.
And think about how hard that is to prove.
And that's very, very difficult to prove, right?
Let's go to Gregory Bradley, who says, what about the guns with no serial numbers? This is a great point. A lot of testimony about barging into his house during those raids, and agents would get on the stand and say, we found all this. We found baby oil, Astroglide, and we found this cache of weapons with serial numbers sanded off. Under the predicate acts, there's no weapons charge. No. There's no gun running charge because they didn't have it.
They just didn't charge him with that. And you have to worry about the control over the guns, just the fact that there's guns found in somebody's house, you need to tie Diddy to those guns. And just the fact they're found in his house isn't going to get you there. And I think prosecutors bit off what they could chew in this case. And by adding a bunch of gun charges that would muddy the waters a little bit, I think it made it very, very difficult. Gun charges can, in fact, shaving a serial number can be a federal crime. So it could have been charged, but it wasn't.
This kind of stuff, muddying the waters, they didn't even include it as a predicate act, is prejudicial to Diddy in such a way that on appeal they could say they introduced all this stuff about guns which inflamed the jury against my client, and it caused them to find him guilty even though there's no illegal act.
No, the answer is no. I mean, you can introduce this kind of atmospheric evidence, right? Evidence that paints a larger picture than beyond just the four corners of the charges, and that's what the prosecutors try to do here.
All right, let's go to some comments. Lukey says, I think we'll get a verdict either tomorrow or Wednesday, no later than Wednesday, from your lips to God's ears. I think you're right as well. I part of me just wants it to be concluded, and I think the quicker the verdict, and it sounds like they're really drilling down and they have some serious questions, I do think we're going to get a verdict in a couple of days. I think it's complicated, but it's also clear, and the evidence was so cumulative. This is a restless jury. They've come to some conclusions. I think we're going to get a verdict.
I completely agree. And Shauna Booth says, juror not able to follow directions is probably involving personal feelings instead of looking and following the law. That is kind of what a lot of people immediately thought. That's why we sort of honed in on this distinction or this use of the word he cannot follow the instructions. If they said refuses to follow the instructions, I would have been more inclined to agree with you. But if they said cannot, but maybe we're just being too sort of specific or looking too much into that word. But there were a lot of people that had the same thought you did, which is the juror is refusing to abide by the law.
One thing I wonder is they've laid down a marker and the judge said, go back and deliberate. But they have said juror number 25 is misbehaving.
Yes.
And the foreperson has made that note to the judge. I wonder if the behavior continues, whether Judge Subramanian at some point, obviously very early on in 2 hours, you just say, hey, you two work it out. It's like a parent saying, you kids work it out. I'm not going to intervene. If it continues and we get into next week and maybe the following week of deliberations and they say juror 25 is misbehaving, not acting in good faith, I do think a remedial measure is possible by Subramanian to put in an alternate.
The defense will
go crazy.
Insane. Because this person they're looking to as the hung juror, right?
Yes.
They're looking for this person. He's the contrarian. He's the jerk in the booth. Maybe he's the one that's
they think he's a pro Diddy guy,
right? Whether he's pro Diddy or not, he's just
frankly.
maybe a contrarian, maybe refusing to sort of participate. That to them is a hung juror.
That's true. That's an opportunity for a mistrial, if not an acquittal.
All right, so we put a poll up. Is this our poll? We did this. This is great. I love it. Diddy YouTube poll: guilty or innocent? 52% say guilty, 47% say innocent. Holy cow, that is tight.
That is so tight. I'm shocked that there are 47% who say that man should just walk out the doors and wish well.
Social media commentators are famously contrarian, right? People if you had I think if everybody had to post their name and their home address, you'd have a lot more guilty.
It is remarkable though. But look, it's interesting to see because I don't know if what it says about us as a country. We're very divided on things, and including Diddy's guilt or innocence, right? I mean, that's just maybe where the country is. I'm one of the 52% for now, but it's interesting to see.
All right, Derek and I will be back tomorrow. We are really hoping we're going to be able to discuss the verdict.
Let's do it.